Today, I'd like to talk about the topic of critical race theory, which is much discussed in our day and time. A lot of opposition to critical race theory, particularly in our own section of Long Island. It's raised a lot at school board meetings. A lot of parents are really agitated and upset about it. Uh, some of the things you hear are critical race theory is just Marxism, and why teach Marxism in our schools? Why teach Marxism to our children? Not a good thing. Also, some people say it's a threat to the American way of life. We have this beautiful way of life in America. We're a great country. Why throw this critical race theory in? It kind of upsets the whole concept of the American way of life. And God bless America, we shouldn't really do that. Not a good thing. Also, some people say it's reverse racism. I mean, you've had racism now where black people and Native Americans and Latinos and Asians and all these different groups are attacked. And now you're going to reverse it. And instead of attacking, black people and Native Americans and all these people, now you're going to start attacking white people. What is this? Reverse racism. Terrible thing. And then another opposition is you're just indoctrinating children. You're putting these ideas into the heads of children. And why do this for children? Do children need this? Is this going to help children? Is it going to make children better? Come on. It's not a good thing. Now, what is the reality? What is this thing, critical race theory, all about? What's the nature of it? Well, first of all, let's look at the history of it. It is a legal theory. It started in the early 1970s. And it started really after the Civil Rights Movement. So the Civil Rights Movement had come, and legal scholars were taking a look at it, seeing what had been accomplished, what had not been accomplished, and they developed critical race theory out of that study. It was based on graduate students. It was done in law schools. Sam Roca, a professor of education philosophy, University of British Columbia in Vancouver, deals with the whole history of this movement. Now, what is the principal concept behind critical race theory? The principal concept is simple. It says that racism is systemic. That is the key concept here. Racism is a systemic thing. What do we mean by systemic? You can define it in different ways, right? By systemic, we mean it's embedded in institutions, it's embedded in culture, it's embedded in values, and most significantly for this study, it's embedded in our laws. So we're not just dealing here with personal bigotry. No, that's not the concept of critical race theory. There is, of course, personal bigotry. Some people don't like people that are different, and they have prejudice. They discriminate against them. That's one thing. That's personal bigotry. Critical race theory does not deal with that. So it kind of takes a look at the history of how this whole thing came about. So we look at chattel slavery, which is a very specific form of slavery where the slave was treated as property. So it wasn't like, a slavery where the person is a servant, or slavery where, I'll say, I'll make an agreement with you and you become my slave. No, this is, you are actually a piece of my property. That's the significance of chattel slavery. You are no longer a human being, you're more or less an object. I can possess you, like I possess a cow, or I possess a chair, or I possess a desk. I possess this, they're a possession of mine. And then that evolved, of course, into, after the Civil War, what we know as Jim Crow, where, again, you again, in a certain place in society and kept in that place. And it further evolved in what we call redlining, which denied mortgages to people of a certain color and restricted where people could live. Now, what do we see today as a manifestation of that systemic concept? Well, we see some clear signs of it, right? We see lower educational attainment. Why is that happening? We see lower home ownership. Why is that happening? We see great income inequality. And finally, we see disproportionate arrest and incarceration rates for Black men. So when you look at all these things together, you get a systemic picture. It's not a question of bigotry, individual bigotry. It's a question that there is a system that is in place that we have to take a look at critically. And again, how we do this, how we study this, these are things to look at. Now, what is the underlying issue? The underlying issue is the complicity of law in upholding white supremacy. That is the key concept. What role does law play in upholding white supremacy? How are the laws fashioned that have been keeping this in place for so long, and are these laws continuing today? You might say, oh, wait a minute, we've got the civil rights movement, it's all over, it's done with. People who study critical race theory say, no, it's not. It's part of the system that we have to deal with. Now, how does this relate to ourselves as Catholics? Well, we have the concept of Catholic social teaching. In Catholic social teaching, you have personal sin, but you also have sin that transcends the individual. For example, Pope John Paul II, in his encyclical letter Solicitudo Rei Socialis in 1987, referred to structures of sin more than a dozen times. So when we're dealing with something that is systemic, we're dealing with a structure of sin, something that has been embedded in our laws, and something that because it is so embedded in our laws, we can become unaware of it, right? It just, we accept it. It's part of our legal system. It's part of how we grew up. And so critical race theory says, well, wait a minute, take a step back. What's happening? Why is this happening? How is the law facilitating this particular evil? The United States Catholic bishops, in their letter on racism recently, Open Wide Our Hearts, talk about systemic racism. And they say that, how is this reflected? Well, it's reflected in higher unemployment rates among minorities, growing income inequality. For example, the median wealth for white households is 10 times greater than that for Black households, and 8 times greater than Hispanic households. Now, you might see and accept some inequality, but 10 times? 8 times? That seems very disproportionate. It seems like, wow, this is crazy. And again, most of us might be unaware of it. Or you might say, well, those people are lazy, they don't work hard. We use those types of excuses maybe for not looking at, this tremendous disproportion in our society. The Federal Reserve in 2014 put the median white income as $141,900. The median Black income, $11,000. So you got $141,000 for whites, Blacks, $11,000. I mean, this is crazy, right? This is like totally out of control. Latino, $13,700. Now, what is it? It's a product of the differential access to good homes in high quality neighborhoods leading to reduced home equity. Most Americans, their wealth is tied up with their home ownership. When you have less home ownership, you're going to have less accumulation, obviously, of wealth, and you're going to have this great disproportion that exists in our society today. Minorities faced and do face today extra hurdles in getting approved for mortgages. And then you also have the inequities in the criminal justice system. Why are so many black men incarcerated at such a great rate? And studies show that they commit crimes the same levels as other people in society, but are disproportionately, because of the system, incarcerated. So again, these are things that you better take a look at, and this is what critical race theory does. Take a look at, talk about. It's not a question of blaming any, one or two individuals here. It's a question of looking at a system and saying, why is this system producing these types of effects? Tina Wall-Pratt, who is Director of Mission Engagement and Strategic Initiatives at Villanova University, says that racial inequality makes people of color and Native people vulnerable to all manner of harm. So because there is this inequality in our society, there is damage that is being done to people every day. And so taking a look at that inequality is obviously very important for us. The precursor to this critical race theory was critical legal studies. So this is something that's done in the legal field. So what you do is you kind of study how the law and legal institutions serve the interests of the wealthy at the expense of the poor. And of course, this would make sense because who writes the laws, who determines the laws, those obviously who are wealthier, right? Because they have access to more access to power, to those who are legislators who are going to write the laws. So it's a system where those who are wealthier are going to be controlling it, and those who are, not as wealthy, those who are on the bottom end of the economic ladder, are not going to have as much input into the laws, into the justice of the laws, obviously. And of course, that makes sense. Others, of course, have written about this. W.E. Du Bois, Fannie Lou Hamer, Pauli Murray, Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado. Civil rights, and the conclusion they come to basically is civil rights legislation and court victories have not eradicated racism. Racial progress has stalled. Why are these trends continuing? And this disparity in wealth actually is growing. I mean, it's not lessening, it's growing. So there's got to be something wrong. We have the civil rights legislation, we have these laws, but we still have this issue ongoing in our society. And why is it? And how can it be addressed? We also see, after some of these laws are passed, we see what we call the backlash against them. People say, oh, now you've gone too far, you're giving too much freedom, you're bending over backwards, this isn't a good thing, and there is the backlash. So we have the laws passed, then we have the backlash, and we see this all the time in our society. What are the common points of critical race theory? What is it based? What is the coherent strategy in terms of the theory itself? Let's look at some of those. Common points would be race is socially constructed and not a biological reality. So this idea of race, it's a social construction to keep a certain group down, certainly not a biological reality. We're 99.9% the same as, different races, supposedly. So it's not really a biological reality at all. Racism is the common, ordinary experience for most people of color in the United States. So if you ask them, yeah, I do experience this. This is what my everyday life is about. We don't think of it that way. We think, oh, everything is fine, no problem. But ask those who are people of color, and they will tell you, yeah, that is my experience. I've experienced it a lot in my life. Legal advancements or setbacks for people of color tend to serve the interests of the white dominant society. So again, which, advances can be made, which setbacks? Well, it is the white society that is really setting the parameters for that. Consistent with what we call intersectionality, no individual can really be identified by membership in a single group. A black person can be, of course, a woman, a Muslim, a lesbian, a writer. So again, confining a person to a certain group, it certainly is not accurate because of the different aspects of a person's life, right? People of color are uniquely qualified to speak on behalf of other members of their group or groups regarding the forms and effects of racism. So, again, the importance of listening. We have to listen to others in the group and say, well, what is your experience of racism like? Races are categories that society invents, manipulates, or retires when convenient. So those are put out there by society, and when it's convenient, we'll go with that. Racism, of course, is codified in laws, embedded in structures, and woven into public policy. Critical race theory rejects the idea that racism can be eradicated through meritocracy or color blindness. Because again, this is something that is part of a structure, a system. So it's not going to end with meritocracy. It's not going to end with color blindness. It is there in the system. So individual racism is not the problem. We can deal with individual racism. That is not the issue. The systemic nature of racism, that is the overriding issue. Now, what are the critics of this critical race theory? The critics say, well, racism is just too present in this theory. You're talking too much about racism here. And it's using this Marxist class struggle of the oppressor versus the victim. So they say, this isn't good, this critical race theory, for that reason. But it is designed really to analyze laws or policies. It is not taught in elementary schools. It is something, again, that would apply to legal theory, will be taught in law schools and on the graduate level. So this is not something that, we're going to put on a first grader or a second grader and say, well, there is systemic racism, and that's not the approach, and it can't be the approach because you're dealing with a very complicated subject. I mean, how could someone in elementary school, how could a young student understand about systems and laws and legal theory? So when looking at this critical race theory, I think we have to distinguish in terms of the history of it. We have to look at what it is saying about our society. And again, there can be a healthy dialogue. Some people say, well, there is no systemic racism. But then how do you explain all of these facts in our society? How do you explain the income inequality? How do you explain the difference in home ownership? How do you explain the difference in incarceration, the difference in health outcomes, the difference in educational outcomes? So these are the things really where the dialogue, the issues where the dialogue takes place. So when thinking about critical race theory, it's good to know what it is, to know the history of it. It started in the 1970s, where it applies, and also to know where it doesn't apply, which is, of course, in elementary school education.